Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to M&P's virtual roundtable discussion. Our topic today is managing the impact of COVID-19 at the board level. We have a very exciting, distinguished panel that represents many different industries across Canada from a governance perspective. Across the country, we'll have representation related to retail, grocery, passenger trains, utilities, life sciences, and other industries. Maybe just to start with a little administrative, if everyone could put their microphones on mute if they're not already, just so that we minimize the background sound. This session will be recorded today. And also, you have the ability in the chat space to submit questions, which we will be looking at. We probably won't be able to address all the questions, but at the end of this, I will try to make time. So my name is Richard Arthurs. I'm a partner, national practice leader of internal audit within Enterprise Risk Services at M&P. I'm also joined by Cooling, who will put his camera on at the end of the session to manage the Q&A portion of today's session. And just for those who are not familiar with enterprise services at M&P, we do manage things like internal audit, enterprise risk management, forensics, cybersecurity, IT audit, internal controls. So a wide variety of different services. So to begin, as everyone knows, within this time that COVID-19 is impacting us in Canada, it's been a very unprecedented time. The stats show, for example, in the month of April, upwards of 3 million jobs displaced in the country. We've had a number of discussions with board members recently, and some of the questions, and there's more, seem to be more questions than answers right now in terms of what's being discussed in the boardroom, what executives and leaders are discussing. For example, what has changed in the industry you're in? What changes in the business model need to be made? What are the new risks facing your organization? For example, we're seeing a significant spike in cyber attacks and red flags around fraud risk that is impacting organizations today. We're also hearing all organizations ask what they can do to help their employees and customers and third parties that they rely on so much. Boards are now asking in meetings, what is the perfect or what is the optimal strategy and business model as we go into this new normal? What is that going to look like? What does winning look like for your organization? How do you define that? And how do you build scenarios and forecasts to complement that? As well, what is the economy going to look like in the fall across Canada? And how soon, for example, will people go back to the office and feel comfortable being back in that office environment? So a lot of questions. That being said, I think we'll start out with a polling question and then I'll introduce our panel. So our polling question is basically currently, what stage of crisis management best describes your organization's current state? So there's three possible answers. The first, respond. So still mostly reacting to the impact of COVID-19. Second is recover, starting to define your future business model. An entire organization is starting to make this new strategy a priority. And maybe some are actually in this thrive stage of actually having a new strategy in place and benefiting from that already. So I'll allow everyone to click on a box and submit your answers. It sounds like we had over 500 registrants today, so we'll have quite a few different answers, I'm sure, coming through. So I'll wait a moment until we can show the results. Okay. The 67% have voted, 224 people. And just wait a minute here and get the final numbers. Can we show the final results? Okay. Well, in the sake of time, I'll start the introductions, and maybe we can come back and show the final results later.
Richard, I can interject. I can see the results. We have 17%. 17% of our audience is in the respond stage. 52% are in the recover stage, and 23% are in the thrive stage. So roughly speaking, half are in recover, and then the other half are in respond or thrive. Thought I would just share that with you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Unfortunately, I couldn't see that on my own screen. So thank you. So on to our distinguished panel. And I'm going to turn off my video so that you can see the entire panel. And I will go through the introductions. So we are very privileged to have on our panel, starting with Patty McLeod, who is the chair of the Calgary Co-op Board, as well as the Calgary Film Centre. And Patty is also a board member with Alberta Innovates and the Beverage Container Management Board. Our second panelist is Francois Bertrand, who is the chair of the board of Via Rail. She's also the president of the ProAction International Board of Directors, serves on the board of Cisco Gold Royalties, and acts as the vice chair of the Concordia University Board of Governors.
Good afternoon.
We also have with us Susan Barber, the chair of the board of Sask Energy. And Susan was also the chair of the Board of Governors of the University of Regina. And we are also very happy to have Deborah Rosati with us, the founder and CEO of Women Get On Board, Inc. And Deborah is a corporate director for Kiran Life Sciences and chair of the audit committee as well with Lyft and Co. So that being said, we will move into our scheduled program. And we have time for each of the panelists to begin by commenting on the current state of the world and from their perspective and from the boards that they are involved with, what they're seeing today. So we'll start out right away and ask Patty if you could start out the comments.
Sure. Thank you very much. I am on a number of boards, but I'm going to speak today primarily from the position that I have as board chair of Calgary Co-op. Calgary Co-op is North America's largest retail cooperative, annual revenues in excess of $1.2 billion. We are a retail cooperative in 6 lines of business, and that includes grocery, which is about 50% of our revenue, liquor, cannabis, petroleum, and then we also are actually Calgary. We're located entirely in Calgary, and we're Calgary's 5th largest real estate property manager, which is sort of one of our quiet secrets. So, because we own so many of our sites in very good locations in Calgary. So we have a mix of business lines that were deemed essential through the COVID situation. And some of them are doing reasonably well, as you would expect, and some are doing extremely poorly due to different demands through COVID. So what I reflect on when we look at, when asked to participate in this from the board's perspective, is really in three different buckets. The first one I'll call react, which is your immediate operational issue. And for us, because grocery and liquor, remarkably, has done extremely well through COVID, demand is certainly up. But our petroleum and our commercial real estate business, 60 to 70% of our tenants are no longer paying rent, and we're not sure whether they will come back. For a commercial real estate business as large as ours, that's had a significant impact. So there are very definitely immediate operational issues. We sort of smiled. Forecasts, budgets, executive compensation measures, balanced scorecard, thrown out the window. Absolutely everything is topsy-turvy to certainly any kind of forecast. Even the forecasts of our grocery mix have changed dramatically because the way we're shopping as consumers has changed. Lots of yeast, lots of flour, lots of meat, not so much what we sort of consider our traditional grocery mix. So a lot of the measures you use as a business have had to go out the window. Health and safety, absolutely top of mind. Supply chain, brand, employee burnout, and then all of the external factors, including in Calgary, world prices, unemployment numbers, economic recession, which frankly we have been dealing with in Calgary since 2015. And we had a number of strategic shifts that we've made over the past 24 months to control more levers from a retail perspective that actually allowed us to play into COVID quite well because we had changed our supplier. And that allowed us to enhance resources in-house and communication in preparation for that strategic change that has just leaned right into to COVID. In the medium, I call it the recovery stage, and I, like 52% of our respondents, would put us in a recovery mode of thinking. However, I call it with a healthy respect for relapse, both from future COVID waves, but I think the economic outcome of the amount of government debt and as government support programs start to fall off, I think we're going to see some really significant relapse opportunities. But really in the medium term, we're trying to figure out what's permanently changed versus what's a temporary setback. Things like food inflation, permanent business closures impacting our real estate, customer perceptions, customer preferences. Are we all going to choose to eat more at home? Have we become foodies because we have changed our lifestyle, as well as economic impacts? The third thing our board is doing then is leaning into reimagination. What is next? How does COVID create opportunity? And how does our strategy fit that? So for us, for example, we had announced in conjunction with partners over $2 billion worth of capital development in Calgary in the next 5 years. I'm going to go out on a limb and imagine that's not all going to happen. So, and that was certainly a significant part of our capital development and strategic plan. E-commerce was something we were hoping to roll out in the next 12 to 24 months. Frankly, we're starting our pilot in about 6 weeks. So, it does shift very dramatically. And the final thing I think we're looking at is we're in a good, strong financial position and balance sheet is what acquisition opportunities will be out there for an organization like ours over the next probably 36 to 60 months, 3 to 5 years. So, that's kind of a picture of what we're looking at immediately. Richard, do you want me to stop there and put it over, or was there anything else additional at this part of the session?
Oh, that sounds
okay.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you. Well, I wish I'd be in the same position at VIA than our friend who just spoke. We have a very different story. The 2000 bug is more the 2020 bug for VIA Real. We started with the blockades, you'll remember, especially in our corridor where our business is really booming. And now it's the pandemic. And as you know, Ontario and Quebec are the two provinces mostly touched by the pandemic. So our businesses has been really hit hard. What is making our life different, of course, is usually we have a good relationship and a dialogue, and we just had completed a strategic plan at the end of 2019, and we had a clear view of where we were heading and the changes that had to occur. And then comes those two crises. After having a year that was fantastic and that was following 4 years of growth, we had 5 million passengers using our trains last year. Well, you can imagine that we had weeks with minimal frequencies where we were happy when there were 200 passengers. So quite a difference. And we are in those segments on the corridor, meaning from Quebec to Toronto, mostly self-sufficient, but we have a responsibility as a public service to, of course, serve Canadians from coast to coast. And that's where we get help from government in terms of subsidy. There's like a quid pro quo that is quite acceptable. But in times of pandemic, where we have hardly any revenues, we've got to call the differential not a subsidy any longer, but a deficit. So there is really that sense of we have to still give the service to Canadians. We're not essential to the degree maybe that other businesses are, but the dimension of the public service is there. So we have to honor that responsibility as a Crown corporation, and yet figure out how resumption of service can be done at a cost that is reasonable, and yet providing the service where the demand will come as the offer develops. We have different type of passengers, as you can imagine, and how will they change? They have already changed, but how will they be changed after the pandemic? We know that telework is there to stay, maybe not to the degree we know, but will we travel as much between Toronto and Ottawa, from Montreal to Ottawa, Montreal to Toronto? Certainly, we are developing scenarios where we say we can organize our travels to be really safe and not costly, so that we can offer that alternative. So it is a real challenge to kind of put that forward, not lay off people, so that when the passengers come back, we're ready to roll. So we are, that makes me smile to say, in which phase are you in your company? Are you kind of just trying to get by, imagine the scenario, or thrive? Well, we're doing the three at this point in time. And just to make sure that we're prepared, developing scenarios for which, like all of us, we have no crystal ball. So we have to go from studies that have been done. And there's always some sense in the Crown Corporation where management is used to the universe of the government. At the board level, it's a mixed composition of people, which many come from the private sector. And there is always on the table the idea, can we reduce costs? What can we do to reduce costs? And looking at what the government has been doing in terms of coming to the help of many workers in Canada, of course, there is a responsibility for VIA to kind of do the same philosophy, or to go with the same type of policy. and make sure that we're not kind of unburden ourselves by burdening more the government. So there is always that balancing act, may I say, right now at the governance level of the board. And it calls for not getting into the operations, but certainly where it's our role as a fiduciary to kind of challenge some views, kind of not look at immediate operations today, but what's coming, what's next. And the temptation is to say, well, we'll wait and see and just develop as it goes, but we've got to be ready for what's going to come. And that's where, of course, it is quite a challenge. But it's lots of fun. And when you have a group of experts by management that is doing all they can to provide their views and their knowledge to the board and vice versa, it's interesting times. And I'm sure there's more to come because it's not over yet. And at a moment where we feel we can
There we go.
I think I'm next. So I can assure you I'm not sitting here in my pajama bottoms, which I think for many has become part of their new way of doing business every day. I am here in my capacity as chair of the board of Sask Energy. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Sask Energy is Saskatchewan's natural gas distribution and transportation company. It is a Crown corporation, and in these times and in all times provides an essential service to residential, farm, commercial, and industrial customers. For Sask Energy, I think as with most organizations, regardless of their status as public or private or not-for-profits or anything of that sort, the immediate focus was responsive and reactionary, aimed primarily at safeguarding the health and safety of the workforce while still delivering an essential service to its customers, which, you know, this isn't winter months, so it wasn't as critical as it can be in those winter months, but there's no doubt that the delivery of natural gas in the province is pretty critical. And it wasn't like we could entirely shut down our operations. The first priority was to get people working remotely where possible and minimizing exposure to the COVID-19 risk by delivering services in a removed or protected fashion. And at the same time, the organization had to contend with a host of risks from people working remotely on a much larger scale, like you heard Richard talk at the beginning, cyber attacks, fraud, monitoring productivity in an area where we hadn't been necessarily able to monitor it before. And now, slowly but surely, Sask Energy, like other organizations, is looking at methodically moving the workforce back into their various roles prior to COVID-19, albeit with some changes. And so when we talk about managing the impact of COVID-19 at the board level, for me, for our organization, I think from a governance perspective, I don't think that the role of the board changed, and nor in my view should it change. The role of the board, crisis or not, continues to be one of oversight, albeit likely more focused than normally on ensuring that the business continuity planning that you hope you make and never have to look at before again is actually being adhered to and being followed. I think from the experience I've had on boards, that's a pretty delicate balance that the board has to maintain in a time of crisis like this that we have seen. You know, on one hand, the board has to allow management to run the business and to adapt to the events as they see evolve day by day and when it first came out, minute by minute. We shouldn't be sticking our fingers in. At the same time, though, consistent with that oversight role, The board needs to be satisfied that management is in fact responding to the issues and managing the risks, and that it's considering the evolution that may or may not be required within the organization as we come out of all of this. For us, for me in particular, maintaining open lines of communication has been key, more so than we would in normal times. For me as the board chair, I have been more focused on checking in regularly with the CEO. We've put a lot of pressure on him. He's an engineer. He's running a natural gas company. He's not used to dealing with this kind of crisis. And so we as a board and I as chair have been particularly concerned with making sure that he's okay and that his people are okay. And so just from the human element, governance for me has meant more that checking in and just making sure that everything's ticking and that he's taking the time he needs to walk around the block or call me if he needs to, or do what he has to take a break, baking even though he can't get yeast, or doing whatever he has to do. So the biggest change for us, common to all boards, has been governing remotely by WebEx or Zoom or whatever mode has been effective. We have certainly completed the business items that have been put before the board effectively. But for my own experience, and this to me would be one of the risks that I see in managing through and beyond the pandemic, is that I don't like it. It's an impersonal way of operating. I like to be able to see the whites of somebody's eyes when I'm talking to them, and I am assessing their body language. I'm checking out their demeanor. I'm seeing how they react to my question. Right now, when I see a room full of executives and they're looking down, I can't tell if they're on their Blackberries, polishing their shoes. I don't know what's going on. I like to be in a room with somebody, and all of those things happen a lot more spontaneously when you're together and in a face-to-face environment. I can't see that as well on a screen. And I recognize that the pandemic has shown us that we can govern differently and that we don't have to be in the same room, but I wouldn't be a proponent of that as a future model for change. I think that the relationships that you develop with management and with your fellow board members are pretty critical to the success and the culture of the organization. And I think that it's far more difficult to cultivate a sense of team in the long run when you're never together. So I think that gathering remotely, as all of us have been forced to do, can offer a pretty cost-effective and efficient mechanism for governing on occasion. But for me, it doesn't beat the face-to-face. So I think from a governance perspective, those are some of the things that we have done to cope. But I don't see those necessarily as long-term permanent changes. I see them as temporary adjustments in response to the crisis, but I don't see them as long-term overhauls. So those are just some comments from my perspective. Thank you.
So I guess I'm not last but not least, or something like that. So thank you. One note I'll make of my fellow panelists. Thank you all. Unique situation. I am not on a Crown Corp. I'm on two public company boards, of which both of them serve the cannabis sector, so life sciences. One is international, they are Colombia-based, and one is Canadian-based. And so I'm going to kind of get more into the brass tactics and talk about financial impact right up front. Day one, lockdowns happen, go into deliberations from a board right away on who do we have to lay off, who do we not, what's the scenario, how do we restructure. So my first weekend of lockdown was deliberations with financial restructuring lawyers, employment lawyers. So it was hands-on right from the beginning. How do we manage? We knew that we didn't have the cash situation. We are in the middle of a transaction, so double whammy. How do you move forward with that when you really don't have a runway? So that was the first day, the first weekend. So that was very responsive. Did a temporary layoff of all employees at the time. Tried to continue business as usual in the best way that you could. The company, Lift & Co., has an event component to the business. And of course, our biggest expo, which was going to take place in Toronto in the end of May, was obviously not going to happen. So everything from how do you mitigate your lease obligations? How do you return deposits to customers? So we're a small board of 4.
Wow.
At the time. I chair the audit committee, so weekly cash flows, daily cash flows coming up the pipeline. So it was a really hands-on exercise. I think to your point, Susan, and to everyone else's point, your job is not to be there nose in, it's to have nose in, fingers out, but not to do day to day. But when you're a small board and you're going through a very tough restructure, viability, sustainability of the company, you got to lean in. Another response we did right away, we deferred any fees as directors on that particular board because we couldn't take any fees if everybody was temporarily laid off. Second board I'm on, Chiron Life Sciences. They are a wellness, medicinal, medical cannabis that are Colombia based. And during the period, they were going through their certification to actually be a licensed producer, getting their certification. And of course, the government shuts down. That delayed the process, but it did happen. We also had employees that, because the cultivation site is not close, is remote from the headquarters, employees had to stay remotely, and there was a lot of generosity from the local community to support them, and from a health and safety and food. And so there was some real operational, I didn't from a board perspective, but the company did. To manage that, but also medical cannabis clinics are essential services. So how do you manage through that? And so I think having the lens, so there was some immediate response from public companies are, will we be delaying our financials? What are the extension period? Will we be delaying our AGM? What's the extension period? How do you conduct virtual meetings, virtual AGMs? I know there's been a lot of discussion on that. But those were the realities facing both companies. They were both public, and you have your fiduciary duty. So what are your reporting obligations? How do you defer it? You've got to work closely with your audit firm. All of a sudden, auditors, they couldn't go down to Colombia. How do you do your audit remotely? And I'm sure Richard could pipe in here, but it was a challenge. How did you ensure that you could have timely financial reporting when you couldn't have your team down in your operational side of the business, and auditors, doing their audit remotely? So it created a bunch of challenges, but with challenges comes opportunity. I would say, with the commitment to finding, maximizing value for shareholders, which obviously you're looking at from a public company, there's lots of opportunities from transactional perspective. And I think, you had to run a process, continue to run a process. So that's been really hands-on. So I've been in the middle of processes as well, not only kind of the respond phase, but more the recovery. How do we maximize, and what are the opportunities going forward? So financial impact was sort of the first thing, looking at that, and how do we extend the runway? And obviously cash is king, so having the financial resources. So in case of Chiron, we did executive compensation reduction right of the way. We did director fee compensation reduction right away. These are best tactics when you're talking about cost reductions. We looked at, our footprint globally. Where should we expand? What countries should we just sort of stay steady state? So when you're looking at it from a global regulatory compliance perspective, and then you've got restrictions from a government perspective, there was a lot of, and keeping informed. And we had cases that were identified with our employees, and the CEO is really good in the communication process. What were they doing? How did they test? And so we were getting reports like that from the field. So I think I've kind of gone through the response into the recovery, but I really can't wait for Thrive, because that's where we all want to get to. But I think we don't know when that's going to be, and I think we've had to put processes. Good communication is really important. I've got a board call after late this evening with potential investors, so it's been a lean in, it's been constant communication. Also, both of my boards are very small. Lift & Co, we're only 3 right now, and Chiron, we're only 5. So you don't have the beauty or the luxury to have a big board to divide and conquer. In one case, Lift & Co, I'm vice chair. In the case of Chiron Life Sciences, I'm lead director. So trying to bring good governance to this pandemic and the unknowns and uncertainty, and responding to the best you can, and being a public company. So lots of nuances. Exciting time to be. I wouldn't want to be just joining a board at this time. I think, Susan, to your point, that communication, we just came off a strategy session. We were all together in Miami in December, and then you go into, and I just joined the board in November. And so I agree that it's challenging to have your meetings virtually, but when your members are in different countries across the world, it sometimes isn't convenient for them to all travel. So I have to say, I'm going to go on a limb. We're going to go to hybrid model. We will not go back to the normal, any, regular frequent meetings in person. That was a luxury. And also, I think it's also going to impact your board composition and your board renewal going forward. I'll put my hat out for Women Get on Board, working with a cannabis company now. And I think they're not restricted by geographic, but it will be a consideration. So someone coming on that board may not be able to actually travel in person to see the cultivation facility. It changes the dynamic of onboarding and communication. And I think, you know what, we're in it together. There's technologies, I think they're getting better and better, but we are going to go hybrid, and we're not going to go back to the way we were. So I think we just all have to be very open and agile and pivot in the direction from good governance perspective. I'm sure most of us were on the ICD. They did their virtual conference on May 28th. Yes, they had some technical challenges, but some great speakers. And really, at the end of the day, as directors, we have fiduciary duty. And having webinars and conversations with peers on challenges that they're facing. A lot of the accounting firms, law firms have had weekly webinars, roundups. And so, as a board member, it's your fiduciary to stay current on all the affairs and what's going on from a compliance and regulatory perspective. So it's been a wild ride. It's going to continue that way. I don't think you join a board. It's not for the faint of heart in any way. And having conversations with your peers, you're not doing on your own. And governance is a big topic, and it's about process and ensuring that you're making good decisions from those processes. So I'm going to pause on that.
Sure. Thank you, Deborah, and thanks, Susan, as well. My mic was on mute earlier, so sorry if you could not hear me. But I wanted to also take a moment to go back to Francois, because your sound turned off at the end, and I thought you might have a few last comments to make.
Still off.
Oh, she's still on mute.
Oh, Francois is still on mute, I think. Oh, still on. Can't. Maybe our AV people can help out.
In the meantime, Richard, why don't I start the question, responding on the questions?
Sure. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much. And we're starting to get questions coming in on the chat line, and perhaps I'll direct the first two questions actually to you, Patricia, because they came related to a couple things that you mentioned. You mentioned employee burnout, and the question specifically was around how the board is managing employee burnout during this pandemic, and perhaps maybe you want to share the information or metrics or disclosures that you get at the board level, and maybe relate that to how you responded to some potential outbreaks that were identified at the Calgary Coop locations.
Yeah, great question. And both really directly related to health and safety, and how does the board engage in in their oversight role, but in these really critical aspects. We have close to 4,000 employees, and maybe I'll start with the outbreaks first. We did have 2 stores that got identified. And to be an outbreak, you had to have more than 5 cases. So we had 2 stores where that occurred. So one of the things we did very early in this, and I probably guess this is true of every single director that's on this call and any of our listeners, is that we really radically changed immediately. And this was done in advance of March 16th. We started this late February as we realized COVID was ramping up. We built in a weekly check-in process. to be tracking the preparations, and also then as we moved into having positive COVID diagnosis. So we had a very regular check-in process. Part of what, once we started getting positive cases, there was the store response, and we certainly wanted to know, were stores having to change hours or close, the deep cleaning, et cetera. The second is the tracing, wanting to understand where the cases were coming from. Were they being spread in store? Was there a change in what we expected to be the safe environment? I can't go out on a limb with exactly, but I believe there's only 2 or 3 cases that actually spread from employees in store. The rest came into our store, which led to our third discovery, which was the importance of understanding. Never occurred to us to check. We have, 60-70% of our employees are casual, which means they're not necessarily full-time dedicated 40 hours a week to Calgary Coop, and lots are either living other lives where they have lots of exposure to other people, or even other part-time jobs. And what we discovered, much like the Cargill meat packing plant situation, no comment on whether they were doing things perfectly in the plants, but one of the biggest issues was carpooling and the living arrangements of employees. And so we discovered we had all kinds of employees that had part-time jobs or were living with or carpooling into Calgary from regions where they were subject to outbreaks. So we did an audit, our HR team did an audit to really better understand where our employees were coming from. And the fourth thing we did was proactively test. So actually both of those stores, the reason they went into outbreak mode is because we asked Alberta Health Services to do testing of every single employee, which for Midtown was 240 employees. So we proactively then, as a board, sanctioned and encouraged, and management was right on top of this, to actually proactively test those stores to get a better handle. And then the fifth thing we did was we now temperature test all of our employees before their shifts. So, I think the COVID situation was fascinating because it was an evolution. As other retail organizations put plexiglass up, that wasn't necessarily our first thought. There was a lot of learning that came from peers, but also as we experienced the situation. Sorry, there's a tree chipper across the street that decided to start. Oh, no. That's great timing. But we were moving with it and trying to adopt best practices as quickly as we could. So on the COVID situation, I can say that the board was, engaged as board chair. I would say very much like Susan mentioned, the phone calls with my CEO and the CFO increased exponentially to check in, both from his side to me to make sure that, was the board getting the information, were there questions, my side to him, how is the team doing? And what do we need to know that we don't know? Because not everything can go into an email. Was really the way we managed that. And we took the stand that transparency was king. And I believe we're the only retailer in Calgary that has posted every single COVID case on our website with full transparency. So that's how the board really engaged in the COVID. Now, as far as employee burnout, this was really fascinating because we knew our frontline. Everybody knows, thank a grocery worker, right? We saw those campaigns. We saw people react incredibly well in the stores. We saw people react less incredibly well. But what I found was fascinating was I was given the opportunity as board chair to get on a phone call with our center managers. So I really like it when you can get to a dynamic where your management will allow you to have more direct access through. And so I was invited to be on the phone with all of our center managers. And through the course of that discussion, there was a lot of talk about wellness and how they were supporting employees and the worries of employees as centers started to have positive cases. And what turned out was we were relying so much on our management leadership to be strong and to communicate and to calm fears that we'd kind of forgotten isn't the right word, but hadn't thought of the fact that they needed support because they were becoming support. And so we actually have brought in counseling support, not only to help them have the tools to deal with family situations and home situations, which don't normally come into the workplace, but in their own strength to manage the stress that they're taking in to try and work with their teams. And so I think, again, it's turned into a learning experience. And what is the board's role in that? The board's role is listening. And it was really through an opportunity where I think I asked a couple of questions differently maybe than management did. And we went, holy smokes, what are you guys dealing with? And it led to a different conversation. So I think it's making it a priority to ask those questions and making it a priority to listen that allows you to deal with it. I think our culture will change. And while I agree that there's a certain amount of nose in, fingers out kind of mentality, I think governance has changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And issues like Me Too, even Black Lives Matters now, and all kinds of cybersecurity and all kinds of issues are coming forward where you can't rely on that compliance checklist and a cadence of quarterly meetings anymore. And I think that COVID and the pandemic is just yet another example of how a crisis-ready board that has a plan and has the right people in place can pivot and shift and monitor and make good decisions. And that's what governance has become. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you very much. I'm going to shift over and I'm going to ask Francois and then perhaps Susan to answer the next question, which is really around the challenging management around the business model as a result of the pandemic. Is the focus on getting back to business as usual and revised objectives in the short to medium term, or are you looking at, new and revised business models? And I know, Patty, you'd used the word reimagination. So perhaps, Francois, because you're in such a very traditional industry with the rails, how much discussion has been around the business model in and of itself during the pandemic?
Well, it's a very traditional business, you're right. But at the same time, given that we're much more in tune with sustainable growth, the rail has become a very interesting mode of transportation looking at the future. So because of that, when we think at VIA today of resumption of service, it's also to kind of do that resumption, counting that it will be a safest mode and a greener mode of transportation. So it's not only a mode of the past, it's a mode of the future. And that's why I was saying the recover, the new model and the thriving is kind of every day in our conversations. And there's tension among ourselves between what's the moment now. And that's why it's so interesting to have a strong management with a strong board where there is constantly that necessity to look at, yes, we've got to make sure we do the proper moves today, but that those moves doesn't prevent us reimagining our future and getting ready, or at least knowing what we'll need to do if we want to change a few elements of our model. Of course, in a Crown corporation, as you can imagine, there is also collective agreement. So there is not always the agility. I was hearing Deborah, where, of course, it's a different world. I'm in a private sector type of board as well. It's very different. But to kind of compose, it's a balancing act, thinking of the employees, thinking of the well-being of either the employees, the management, our clientele, and yet our shareholder. And that he will be proud of what we're doing, not only today, but in 2 years from now, when the account will be done of what it has cost to maintain service and to develop service, the shareholder, and in fact, it's us, the taxpayers, will have to say, well, VIA did the right thing at the right moment and got prepared for the future. So I would be lying to you if I tell you that it's easy. It's not easy. But the dialogue is good. It's very dynamic. Maybe some will find that it's too dynamic sometimes, but I think that's a kind of a necessary tension if we are as fiduciary playing our role. As you said, we have a weekly information session, and I'm in constant relationship with the chair, the CEO, as chair, of course. And we try to understand, and not the minute, but when we think of other ways of what's happening in other businesses, we try as board members to bring it to the attention of management, who's overwhelmed right now in trying to just get through what is still not after the crisis. We're still in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So
thank you very much for that. Susan, maybe I'll get you to sort of chime in on the business model discussion, and then I'm going to shift to Deborah for another final question.
Sure. Certainly, I mean, whether as a result of the pandemic or not, we always challenge management to try to look at, you know, different ways to approach the business model. The reality for Sask Energy is that, you know, we've continued in business, so it isn't getting back to business as much because we've been an essential service that's been continuing. But, and Deborah, I get it. I mean, you and I have very, very different governance obligations, because I don't have to dive in the trench as much as you have to, and I totally appreciate that, and I'm probably luckier than you. But you know, like when you consider the kind of challenges, fiscal challenges that our great-grandchildren are going to face as a result of the federal spending that's had to occur, we are all facing those same sort of challenges provincially as well, with every province as a goal wanting to get back on its own 2 feet and get its economy growing. Our government is going to be putting out a budget pretty soon that, whereas pre-pandemic would have had us coming out even, is now going to have us coming out way behind the 8 ball. And so as a result of the pandemic, there has to be looking at, is there a different way that you can deliver the service or provide the service that you do? Some things can't change, and our biggest stakeholder is the government. And so, you know, we receive a fair bit of direction, as you might expect to, in that respect. But I think for sure we challenge management to look at different ways of delivering things, and we as a board a different way of governing things. That's just going to be the reality.
Thank you very much for that, Susan. Maybe shifting gears a bit, and maybe I'll direct this one to Deborah, and that is, do you think the COVID-19 crisis will accelerate, decelerate, or stay the same in terms of the diversity agenda for boards out there?
Oh, love the question.
Good afternoon.
My sole purpose in life.
Here I am.
I would say
busy afternoon talking about.
You know what? It's a great question because
are we recovering, thriving? Well, I say all of the above. There's not a definite moment where we're out of it yet.
Sorry, Francoise. Yeah, I'll just get, okay, I think we're good. So back to Deborah.
Back to Deborah.
Thank you. So great question. You know, this is 2020. The fact is that we're still having conversations on boards need more diversity around the table. Still surprises me. Only 18.1% as of last year, 2019, for TSX listed companies had women on the board. I think that there's a lot of studies going out that through this process of ESG and sustainability and viability, women tend to have some more of those skills around the table. So conversations I'm having with boards is they know it's the right thing to do to bring women on boards. They know diversity is important regardless of what the Canadian Business Corporations Act is prescribing. But they just know it's the right thing. We're on our second board shortlist service since in the last 2 months, and they're looking, spoke to the chair of the nominating corporate governance, and he's basically saying, yes, we need more diversity and we need to do something. So I always say that we all can be agents of change in diversity, and I think we're going through this change period with pandemic, and you need to have people that are open-minded and diverse in thought, and that's where diversity brings to a board, is that different thinking, those different viewpoints, those challenges. We've never been here before. And I can tell you, diversity includes younger demographic. And you know what? With new technologies and hybrids that are going on and how you do meetings, I think we can learn from the younger demographic. So I think diversity is going to continue to be considered. And I also think it'll bring us forward when we get to the other side of the pandemic, because I think boards are changing, and the skill sets that you needed yesterday are different than the skill sets you need tomorrow. The diversity of thought is going to be critical for that viability, and it just makes good business sense.
Thank you very much for that. We have a number of questions around risk, and maybe if I can just spend 1 minute on this, and maybe this is called the last rapid fire question for each of you three panelists, is what are the top 2 risks that are on your mind as you look over the next, the short term? What are the top risks on the minds of the board? I'll start with you, Patricia.
Patty's fine. Top 2 risks, people first, and I put that as health and safety and culture. And then I think the second one, oh gosh, there's so many. I think the second one I would probably put at trends and social change. I think the risk to a retailer, a bricks and mortar organization, is not only responding to things like for grocery, healthy and fresh and local, and climate change and carbon footprint, but actually e-commerce and technology disruption and how we're getting our food. So those would be my 2.
Susan?
Purely COVID related, I would say for sure people, like making sure that we can get the people back safely, effectively, doing what they were doing before, or like some people are very frightened to come back, right? And so Saskatchewan, I think, has been luckier than a lot of provinces in dodging the COVID bullet, but it's still there, and the risk of relapse is there. So for sure it's the people. And then I think it's what we look like going forward, because to me, that recovery phase, the recovery phase is still very much reactionary, and so it's reacting to what we need to do to move forward, and I think that's going to be one of our significant risks to manage.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
I'm just coming back on. I think I don't want to echo, but people safety, because your number 1 asset in a company are your people. So people first. And I'd say technology second. And technology is pervasive in how you do business and the way you do business. And I think that's going to be so critical. So we have to innovate and stay ahead. We don't know what that being ahead is. So people and technology would be my 2 biggest risks.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Richard, to wrap it up. And before I sign off, there was some compliments to our panel around board members willing to lean in and help out management, and that's a welcome compliment. So thank you for those comments, and they were really appreciated. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Rob. And first and foremost, I want to thank the entire panel. I literally took about 4 pages of notes, and if I tried to summarize it all, I probably wouldn't do justice to all the great insight that's been provided, and we will be capturing all of this in a white paper that we will provide, and everyone will have access to that. But first and foremost, Patty and Susan and Deborah, thank you. And Francois had to jump off onto another call. She's a very busy person today, but thank you very much for making the time to be here today. I think if I were to just capture a couple key points that were mentioned that I think stick with all of us, it's really around the importance of communication, agility, helping each other, listening in this time of COVID. I think that as we go forward, that communication piece won't change, that with uncertainty, we need to communicate and help each other through this time. And I think that we're all sort of on these boards and in these governance roles as agents of change, and to recognize that we all have a responsibility to really try to understand how this is going to play out and be willing to and open to change as time goes on. So with that being said, I'll bring it to a close, and thank you to the entire panel, and thank you to everyone who logged in today to join us. I'm excited to see the white paper once it gets completed, so we'll share that as soon as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.